Imagine a silence so profound that the only sound is the rhythmic grinding of teeth against stone. But it isn't stone, it's dinner. To understand the American Civil War, one must look beyond the blue and gray uniforms, beyond the smoke of the Gettysburg cornfields, and peer directly into the wooden crates stacked high in the mud of Virginia. Inside those crates lay the sheet iron cracker, the Molar Breaker, the infamous Hardtack. For a soldier in 1862, this wasn't just food, it was a curse, a weapon, and a survival tool, all wrapped into a 3-inch square of flour and water. The story of Hardtack begins long before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. Since the days of the Roman legions and the Royal Navy of the 1700s, armies had searched for a way to feed men on the move without the food rotting in a week. The solution was ship's biscuit. By the time of the American Civil War, the recipe hadn't changed for centuries. It was a masterpiece of culinary minimalism: white flour and water. No salt, no yeast, no lard. The goal was total dehydration. If you remove all moisture, you remove the possibility of life, including the bacteria that cause rot. But as the soldiers would soon discover, life always finds a way, usually in the form of the dreaded weevil. The production of these biscuits was a massive industrial undertaking. In the North, giant government bakeries in Alexandria, Virginia, worked 24 hours a day. Imagine the heat of these massive brick ovens, the air thick with white flour dust, and the endless mechanical thud of the clapper machines that stamped out the holes. Each square had to be precisely 3 1/8 inches long and ½ an inch thick. The holes, usually 13 or 16 of them, were not for decoration. Without those holes, the center of the biscuit would remain soft, leading to mold. They had to be baked until they were as dry as the desert. When they were finished, they were packed into heavy wooden boxes, 50 pounds each, and branded with the simple words, "Army bread." But army bread was a polite term. To the men in the trenches, it was worm castles. Because the government often contracted the baking to private companies looking to make a quick profit, the quality varied wildly. Some contractors used cheap floor sweepings instead of clean flour. Others didn't bake the biscuits long enough, leaving the centers moist. By the time these crates reached a regiment after weeks in a humid train car, the transformation was complete. A soldier would pry open a fresh crate with his bayonet, only to find the top layer covered in a fine, moving carpet of brown beetles. This was the psychological warfare of the stomach. Imagine being 19 years old, hundreds of miles from your mother's kitchen, standing in the rain, and being handed a ration of 3 or 4 of these crackers. They were so hard that if you dropped one on a rock, it wouldn't shatter, it would bounce. If you tried to bite it dry, you could hear the audible crack of enamel. Soldiers with poor teeth, which was most of them, were in constant agony. They would use the butts of their rifles to smash the crackers into smaller pieces, or they would wrap them in a rag and hit them with a stone. The arrival of a hardtack shipment was often met with a mixture of hope and horror. Once the wooden crates were pried open, the true nature of the army bread was revealed. If a crate had been sitting in a humid warehouse in Washington, D.C., or a damp pier in New Orleans, the biscuits underwent a terrifying metamorphosis. This brings us to the most infamous inhabitants of the Civil War diet, the boerworms and weevils. Soldiers quickly learned that their food was alive. The common flour weevil, Cepholius granarius, and various species of maggots found hardtack the perfect nursery. They would tunnel through the dense flour, creating a network of tiny caves within the biscuit. When a soldier broke his cracker, he would often find it hollowed out, filled with a fine, bitter dust, which was essentially insect excrement. This was the reality of the 1860s. There were no preservatives, no plastic packaging, and no FDA regulations. You ate what was in the box, or you didn't eat at all. The veteran soldiers developed a dark sense of humor regarding their uninvited guests. They began to refer to the maggots as fresh meat and the weevils as smaller rations. A common joke among the Union troops was that the hardtack was so full of life that if you didn't hold it down, it would crawl off your plate. But beneath the humor lay a grim necessity. To make the crackers edible, soldiers resorted to skirmishing their food. They would drop the hardtack into a tin cup of boiling coffee. As the water heated the biscuit, the insects would be forced out of their tunnels. The maggots, being lighter, would float to the surface. The soldiers would skim them off with a spoon or a dirty finger, and then drink the coffee and eat the softened mush at the bottom. But the insects were only half the battle. The other half was the chemistry of decay. When hardtack got wet and stayed wet, it developed a thick green-black mold. Eating this moldy bread led to the Virginia quickstep, a polite soldier's term for the violent, dehydrating diarrhea that killed more men than Confederate lead. In the medical records of the war, chronic diarrhea and dysentery are the leading causes of death. These men's digestive systems were being shredded by a combination of rock-hard, indigestible flour and toxic fungi. Despite its name and its nature, hardtack was the canvas upon which the soldiers painted their culinary survival. A man cannot live on dry crackers alone, but when combined with the other standard ration, salt pork, the hardtack became a versatile, if disgusting, ingredient. Salt pork was exactly what it sounds like, chunks of hog fat and skin preserved in barrels of brine. It was often blue or translucent with age, and so salty that it would sting a man's throat. The most famous creation of the camp was hellfire stew. To make this, a soldier would take his salt pork and fry it in a heavy iron pan until the grease pooled at the bottom. Then he would take his smashed hardtack, broken into bits with a hammer or a musket butt, and toss it into the boiling fat. The hardtack would absorb the grease, softening the core while crisping the outside. It was a caloric bomb, designed to give a man enough energy to carry a 60-pound pack for 15 miles. Then there was labskas. This was a more elaborate dish, usually made when a regiment was in a semi-permanent camp. It involved boiling hardtack with whatever vegetables could be foraged, a polite word for stolen, from nearby southern farms, onions, potatoes, or wilted cabbage. The hardtack acted as a thickening agent, turning the watery broth into a thick, glutinous paste. It was filling, but it was heavy. A soldier's stomach after a meal of labskas felt like it had been filled with wet cement. In the rarest of times, when a soldier managed to get his hands on some molasses or sugar, he would make hardtack pudding. This involved soaking the crackers in water overnight until they reached the consistency of dough, then mixing in the sweetener and frying it. For a man who hadn't seen a piece of fruit or a sweet treat in 6 months, this greasy, sugary mush was better than any feast in New York or Richmond. It was a temporary escape from the salt and the dust of the march. To understand why the hardtack was so often intolerable, we have to look away from the battlefield and toward the mahogany desks of Washington and Richmond. The Civil War was the first industrial war, and where there is massive government spending, there is inevitable corruption. The term shoddy actually entered the American lexicon during this era to describe the poor quality goods sold to the Army. While it usually referred to uniforms that fell apart in the rain, it applied equally to the Army bread. Government contractors were paid by the pound. This created a perverse incentive. The heavier the crate, the bigger the paycheck. Some unscrupulous bakers began mixing their flour with cheaper fillers. There are historical accounts of hardtack being found with high concentrations of chalk, plaster of Paris, or even fine white sand. These additives didn't just make the crackers heavier, they made them dangerous. A soldier eating chalk-filled hardtack would suffer from severe constipation, followed by agonizing abdominal cramps, further weakening an army already ravaged by disease. Furthermore, the inspection process was a farce. A lone government inspector might be responsible for checking 10,000 crates in a single day. He would pry open one box, see that the top layer looked white and dry, and stamp the whole lot passed. Underneath that top layer, however, could be thousands of biscuits that were either half-baked or already teeming with larvae. This systemic failure of oversight meant that the Union and Confederate governments were essentially paying private businessmen to poison their own soldiers. As the war dragged into 1863 and 1864, the experience of eating hardtack began to diverge sharply between the North and the South. For the Union soldier, the problem was usually the quality of the hardtack. For the Confederate soldier, the problem was the existence of it. The North had the breadbasket of the Midwest and a functioning railroad system. Even when the hardtack was buggy, it was usually there. But the South was primarily a tobacco and cotton-producing economy. They didn't have the massive wheat mills or the industrial bakeries required to produce hardtack on a continental scale. As the Union Navy's Anaconda Plan squeezed Southern ports and Union cavalry tore up Southern tracks, the Confederate logistics chain snapped. The Confederate equivalent of hardtack was often made of cornmeal, which they called corn dodgers. While corn is nutritious, it lacks the gluten found in wheat, meaning it doesn't hold together well as a portable cracker. It crumbled into dust in the haversack. By the siege of Vicksburg, Confederate soldiers were reduced to eating pea bread, a disgusting concoction made from ground cowpeas that caused massive bloating and gas. When they could get their hands on captured Union hardtack, it was treated like gold. It wasn't uncommon for a Confederate soldier to risk his life crawling into no man's land just to scavenge a few Union crackers from a fallen enemy's bag. Hunger is a powerful demotivator. In the winter of 1862, near the Rappahannock River, several Union regiments reached their breaking point. After weeks of being issued nothing but moldy, worm-eaten biscuits, a small-scale mutiny broke out. Soldiers refused to fall in for drill, instead stacking their crates of hardtack in the center of the camp and setting them on fire. They chanted "bread or blood" until the officers were forced to break into the emergency rations of flour and sugar to appease the men. Discipline in the Civil War was often maintained through the stomach. If a regiment performed poorly in battle, their soft bread, freshly baked loaves, privileges were revoked, and they were put back on a strict diet of hardtack and water. Conversely, after a victory, generals would sometimes authorize a feast, which usually just meant double rations of hardtack and perhaps a small ration of whiskey. This created a strange psychological bond between the soldier and his cracker. It was the measure of his status, his reward, and his punishment.
Let's talk about the physical properties of a perfect piece of hardtack. If it was properly made, it was essentially a ceramic tile. Soldiers discovered that if they soaked it in water and then let it dry again, it became even harder as the starch molecules rebonded into a tighter lattice. Because of this extreme density, hardtack became a primitive form of entertainment. Soldiers would have cracking contests to see who could break a biscuit with a single blow of their fist. They would use them as playing cards, scratching numbers onto the surface with a charred stick. They would even use them as plates to hold their greasy pork, then eat the plate afterward to ensure no calorie went to waste. But the physics of the biscuit also had a grim side. Many soldiers suffered from scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Scurvy makes the gums soft and the teeth loose. Imagine trying to eat a biscuit that requires 50 pounds of pressure per square inch to break, while your teeth are literally loose in your jaw. Many veterans return from the war with the Civil War smile, a mouth missing most of its front teeth, shattered by years of fighting the army bread. To understand the true horror of the hardtack diet, we must look at the human body as a machine that was slowly being starved of the parts it needed to function. While a single piece of hardtack provided roughly 100 to 150 calories, these were empty calories, pure carbohydrates with almost no vitamins, minerals, or fats. When a soldier lived on this for months, his body began to consume itself. Military surgeons of the 1860s were beginning to notice a pattern. They called it general debility, but today we recognize it as a combination of extreme malnutrition and chronic infection. The lack of vitamin C meant that the collagen holding the body together began to fail. Old wounds from years prior would miraculously reopen. Skin would bruise at the slightest touch, and most famously, the gums would swell and bleed. For a soldier in this condition, biting into a standard-issue hardtack was not just difficult, it was an act of self-mutilation. Every bite could result in a tooth being left behind in the cracker. Furthermore, the hardtack acted as a mechanical irritant in the digestive tract. Because it was often eaten half-softened or smashed into sharp shards, it physically scraped the lining of the stomach and intestines. This made the soldiers even more susceptible to the bacteria found in camp water. It was a vicious cycle. The hardtack weakened the gut, the water introduced the bacteria, and the resulting diarrhea ensured that none of the nutrients from the hardtack were actually absorbed. Many men died with stomachs full of undigested flour, their bodies unable to process the very thing meant to save them. Nowhere was the drama of hardtack more intense than during the great sieges of the war, most notably at Vicksburg in 1863. As Ulysses S. Grant tightened the noose around the city, the Confederate defenders and the trapped civilians ran out of everything. Flour was the first to go. The Confederate hardtack in Vicksburg became a legendary horror. When the wheat ran out, they turned to ground cowpeas, a type of legume normally reserved for cattle. They tried to bake this pea flour into crackers using the same method as hardtack. The result was a bitter, acidic biscuit that caused violent flatulence and stomach cramps so severe that men were doubled over in the trenches, unable to hold their rifles. As the siege progressed into its second month, the bread became even more desperate. There are accounts of soldiers mixing sawdust with their remaining flour to add bulk to the crackers. They were literally eating wood to fool their stomachs into feeling full. By the time Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th, the primary demand of the Confederate soldiers wasn't for freedom or to keep their sidearms. It was for real Yankee hardtack. When the Union rations finally arrived, men who had been shooting at each other hours earlier sat down together to share the sheet iron crackers like it was a Thanksgiving feast. To a starving man, even a wormy biscuit is a miracle.
To a 21st century observer, the way a Civil War soldier carried his food seems impossibly primitive. He didn't have a backpack with organized compartments. He had a haversack. This was a simple canvas bag, usually painted with black tar or oilcloth to make it somewhat waterproof. It hung by a single strap over his shoulder, bouncing against his hip with every step of a 20-mile march. The haversack was a dark, damp, and dirty place. Inside, a soldier would keep his tin cup, his spoon, his extra socks, and his hardtack. Because the biscuits were rarely wrapped in anything, they would absorb the smells and grime of everything else in the bag. If a soldier's extra socks were wet and sweaty, the hardtack would absorb that moisture. If his tin of grease, used for cleaning his rifle or his boots, leaked, the hardtack would be coated in it. By the end of a long campaign, the army bread at the bottom of a haversack was often a pulverized mess of crumbs, dirt, and lint. But even this hardtack dust was precious. Soldiers would scrape the bottom of their bags and boil the debris into a thin gruel. This was the boring history of the war, not the grand charges, but the quiet, desperate struggle to keep a few ounces of flour clean enough to swallow. When the war finally ended, you might think the soldiers never wanted to see a piece of hardtack again. But human psychology is strange. The food that had represented their suffering became the ultimate symbol of their brotherhood. In the 1880s and 90s, the Grand Army of the Republic, the massive Union Veterans Organization, held campfires. At these events, elderly men would gather, put on their old moth-eaten uniforms, and sit around a fire. Central to these meetings was the hardtack ceremony. They would break the crackers together, often dipping them in coffee, just as they had done in the mud of the wilderness or the heat of Georgia. Some veterans even became collectors. There is a famous story of a veteran who kept a piece of hardtack issued to him in 1861. He had it encased in a silver frame. For him, that cracker was a relic of the man he used to be, a man who could survive on nothing but grit and flour. It was a testament to the fact that they had endured the unendurable. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Civil War was how soldiers used art and music to cope with their miserable diet. When your stomach is empty and your teeth are breaking, sometimes the only thing left to do is laugh. This led to the creation of several hardtack songs. The most famous was a parody of a popular song called Hard Times Come Again No More. The soldiers changed the lyrics to Hardtack Come Again No More. The lyrics went something like this: "'Tis the song, the sigh of the hungry, hardtack, come again no more. Many days you have lingered upon our stomach sore. Oh, hardtack, come again no more." Imagine thousands of men in a camp, their voices rising through the smoke of the pine fires, singing this together. It wasn't just a song, it was a communal protest. They wrote poems in their diaries dedicated to the sheet iron cracker, personifying the biscuit as a stubborn enemy that wouldn't die. This folklore of the food helped build a unique military culture that had never existed in America before. It was a culture bonded by shared physical trauma.
During the war, many military attachés from Europe, England, France, and Prussia came to observe the conflict. They were shocked by what they saw, especially the American diet. European armies, even then, tried to provide fresh bread whenever possible. They had mobile field ovens that followed the troops. The American reliance on a brick-like biscuit seemed barbaric to them. One British observer noted in his journals that the American soldier was singularly lean and gaunt, attributing it to the atrocious mass of dried flour they were forced to consume. He remarked that a European soldier would have mutinied within a week if given such rations. But the American soldier, whether from the North or the South, was different. There was a rugged individualism and a stubbornness that allowed them to keep marching on food that would have sidelined a professional European army. This hardtack endurance became a hallmark of the American fighting spirit. To reach the level of detail needed for a 2-hour documentary, we must look at the science of the flour itself. In the mid-19th century, flour was not the highly refined, bleached white powder we see in stores today. It was stone ground, meaning it contained more of the wheat germ and oils. While this made it more nutritious, it also made it go rancid much faster. When the oils in the flour oxidized, the hardtack would take on a bitter, soapy taste. To combat this, some bakeries would overbake the crackers, essentially carbonizing the outer layer. This created a biscuit that was literally part charcoal. Soldiers found that this charred hardtack actually helped with their stomach aches. Charcoal is still used today to treat certain types of poisoning, so they would intentionally burn their crackers over the campfire before eating them. They were unknowingly practicing a primitive form of medicine. As with any scarce resource, hardtack became a form of currency. In the Union camps, where tobacco was often scarce but hardtack was plentiful, a soldier could trade 3 crackers for a plug of chewing tobacco. In the Confederate camps, where tobacco grew in the backyard but flour was non-existent, the exchange rate was the opposite. This led to the picket line exchange. On the front lines, often separated by only a small creek or a narrow field, Yanks and Rebs would call out to each other. "Hey Johnny, got any leaf? Hey Yank, got any bread?" They would meet in the middle or tie their goods to a rock and throw it across the line. This underground economy was the only way many soldiers managed to get a balanced diet. If a Union soldier had scurvy, he might trade a week's worth of hardtack to a Southern farmer for a single shriveled onion. In these moments, the politics of the war vanished, replaced by the universal language of trade and hunger. For a 2-hour deep dive, we have to consider the physics of the march. A standard ration was 9 to 12 crackers a day. Over a 3-day march, that was nearly 36 crackers. While they were dry, they weren't weightless. Added to the weight of the salt pork, the rifle, the 60 rounds of ammunition, and the wool blanket, every ounce counted. Soldiers often faced a life-or-death choice at the start of a march. Do I carry all this food and protect myself from future hunger, or do I throw it away to save my back and legs? Thousands of hardtack crackers littered the roadsides of the South. After the Battle of Shiloh, it was said you could follow the path of the retreating armies simply by the trail of discarded army bread. This waste was a tragedy of logistics. Men were starving in the hospitals, while thousands of pounds of perfectly good crackers were being trampled into the mud by the retreating columns. As we continue this deep dive, we must look at the desperate industrial failure of the Confederate States of America. While the North had a pre-existing infrastructure of massive steam-powered bakeries, the South was forced to build theirs from scratch under the pressure of a total blockade. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Augusta tried to establish government bakeries, but they lacked the one thing required for hardtack: consistency. In a Southern bakery, the flour might be wheat one day, corn the next, and ground peas the day after that. Because the Southern railroads were often destroyed by Union raids, the fuel for the ovens, wood and coal, rarely arrived on time. This meant that Confederate hardtack was often underbaked. A soft hardtack is a death sentence. It rots within 48 hours. Confederate soldiers often opened their haversacks to find a gray, fuzzy mass that smelled like a swamp. To eat it was to risk death by infection. To throw it away was to starve. This led to the Confederate survival strategy. Since they couldn't rely on the factory-made biscuit, Southern soldiers became masters of the fire cake. They would take their meager ration of cornmeal, mix it with water from a muddy puddle, and slap the paste onto a hot stone or the blade of their bayonet. It was charred on the outside and raw in the middle. Compared to this, the Union's buggy hardtack was a luxury. In fact, many Union soldiers used the quality of their hardtack as a psychological weapon, tossing fresh crackers into Confederate trenches to show how well supplied the North was, demoralizing the hungry men in gray. The story of hardtack isn't just a story of men in uniform. As the war progressed, the military began seizing all available flour for the armies. This left the civilian population, mothers, children, and the elderly, with nothing. In 1863, the bread riot broke out. Thousands of women, armed with knives and pistols, marched on the Confederate capital, screaming for bread. They weren't asking for cake. They were asking for the same rock-hard biscuits the soldiers were eating. When the government couldn't provide it, the rioters broke into warehouses. What they found were crates of hardtack destined for the front lines. The sight of mothers fighting over maggot-filled crackers is one of the most haunting images of the war. It shows that hardtack wasn't just a military ration, it was the thin line between civilization and total collapse. In the most gruesome sections of historical diaries, we find mentions of the hardtack grave. During the rapid movements of the Overland Campaign, there was no time for proper burials. When a soldier fell, he was often buried where he lay. His comrades, in a final act of grim tribute, would sometimes place his remaining rations, his hardtack, inside the grave with him. There was a superstitious belief among some regiments that a man shouldn't go into the afterlife on an empty stomach. Others did it simply because they couldn't bear to eat the food of a dead friend. Years later, when many of these bodies were exhumed to be moved to national cemeteries, investigators found pieces of hardtack still sitting in the skeletal hands of the soldiers. The biscuits had outlasted the flesh of the men they were meant to sustain. This is the ultimate boring but terrifying fact. The food was more permanent than the soldiers. By 1864, during Sherman's march to the sea, a new type of soldier emerged, the bummer. These were foragers who left the main Union columns to strip the countryside of food. For these men, hardtack became a backup plan. They were eating fresh ham, sweet potatoes, and chicken stolen from Georgia plantations. However, even the bummers kept their hardtack. Why? Because the Grand Army was moving so fast that they couldn't stop to cook. A bummer might have a stolen turkey in his hand, but if he had to fight a skirmish, he couldn't stop to roast it. He would reach into his haversack, pull out a piece of hardtack, and eat it while firing his rifle. It was the original fast food of the 19th century, fuel for the engine of destruction that was tearing the South apart. To provide a modern perspective for your video, we can look at what forensic archaeologists have found. When examining the remains of Civil War soldiers, scientists look for compression fractures in the molars. They have found a specific type of dental wear that is unique to this era. The constant grinding of the abrasive, sand-like texture of hardtack acted like sandpaper on the teeth. Moreover, because the hardtack was so dry, it required an immense amount of saliva to break down. This led to chronic dehydration. A soldier's body would prioritize his blood and organs, leaving his mouth dry. Eating hardtack in a state of dehydration is like trying to chew glass. This physical struggle, the simple act of salivating enough to swallow, was a daily labor that we, in the age of soft food and easy hydration, can barely comprehend. As the war entered its final stages, the outcry over the quality of army bread reached the halls of Congress. The Committee on the Conduct of the War began investigating why so much taxpayer money was resulting in worm-infested, inedible stone. This led to a series of scandals involving contractor fraud. Investigators discovered that some bakery owners were bribing government inspectors with whiskey and gold to overlook crates filled with sweepings from the mill floors. In one famous case, a contractor in New York was found to be using flour that had been condemned for civilian use because it contained high levels of ergot, a fungus that can cause hallucinations and gangrene. While the soldiers were in the mud, these merchant princes were building mansions in the north. The trials were a media sensation of the 1860s, proving that the soldier's greatest enemy wasn't always across the picket line. Sometimes it was the man who signed the supply contract. In the folklore of the camp, hardtack was so notoriously hard that stories began to circulate about its use as ammunition. While mostly exaggerated for humor, these stories reflect the soldier's genuine awe at the biscuit's density. One account from a soldier in the 20th Maine describes a mock battle in camp where soldiers threw hardtack at each other instead of snowballs. The result was a dozen men sent to the infirmary with bruised ribs and blackened eyes. There is even a legend, though unverified, of a Confederate blockade runner who, having run out of iron cannonballs, fired crates of desiccated 3-year-old hardtack at a Union vessel. While likely a tall tale, it illustrates the universal truth of the era. Hardtack was perceived as more of a building material than a food group. It was the concrete of the 19th century. As the Civil War drew to a close, the failure of the hardtack diet sparked a revolution in military science. The massive death tolls from scurvy and dysentery forced the U.S. Army to rethink how it fed its men. This was the birth of canned rations. During the later years of the war, innovators like Gail Borden were perfecting condensed milk, and others were experimenting with desiccated vegetables, a precursor to modern dehydrated camping food. Soldiers called these dried vegetable blocks sanitary soup, and though they hated the taste, it provided the nutrients that the hardtack lacked. The hardtack era was the painful, tooth-shattering transition between the ancient world of ship's biscuit and the modern world of the MRE, meal ready to eat. Every modern soldier eating a vacuum-sealed meal owes a debt of gratitude to the men who had to endure the Molar Breakers of the 1860s.
To end this 2-hour journey, we must imagine the silence after the surrender at Appomattox. As the soldiers began their long walks home, some to Massachusetts, some to Alabama, they carried their haversacks one last time. For many, the very last thing they ate as a soldier was a piece of hardtack. It was the constant companion. It saw the horror of the sunken road at Antietam. It heard the screams of the wilderness. It felt the frozen fingers of the men at Valley Forge and the burning sun of Vicksburg. It was a witness to the breaking of a nation and the slow, painful mending of it. The hardtack wasn't just a biscuit. It was the physical manifestation of the American soldier's ability to suffer in silence, to march on an empty stomach, and to survive when every law of biology said they should have perished. When we look at a piece of hardtack in a museum today, gray, dusty, and incredibly small, it looks insignificant. But that small square held the energy of a continent. It was the fuel of history. It was the bread of war. While the infantry struggled with hardtack in the mud, the sailors of the Union and Confederate navies faced an even more claustrophobic hell. On a warship, moisture was not just a weather condition, it was a constant state of being. Hardtack stored in the bread lockers of a wooden frigate or a cramped ironclad like the USS Monitor faced unique challenges. The salt air reacted with the flour, often creating a sticky, brined exterior that tasted like the ocean itself. Sailors often had to contend with the black weevil, a specific breed of beetle that thrived in the dark, humid holds of ships. Because a ship could be at sea for months, the freshness of the hardtack was non-existent. There are accounts of naval hardtack being so infested that sailors would eat in total darkness. They didn't do this for atmosphere. They did it so they wouldn't have to see the movement of the biscuit in their hands. The crunch was accepted. The sight was too much to bear. To truly grasp the 2-hour scale of this story, we must listen to the voices of those who were there. Elisha Hunt Rhodes, a famous diarist of the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteers, wrote extensively about his relationship with Army bread. In one entry, he describes a period of several days where the supply wagons could not reach them. He wrote, "We have been reduced to the dust at the bottom of our bags. I found a piece today that had been soaked in oil from a lamp. I ate it anyway." This wasn't just hunger. It was a breakdown of human dignity. Rhodes describes the hardtack ritual, how a group of men would huddle together, not to talk about the war or their families, but to silently help each other crack their biscuits using a single shared hammer. It was a bonding experience born of shared suffering. The sound of that hammer hitting the bread was as common in camp as the sound of the bugle. You cannot talk about hardtack for 2 hours without talking about Civil War coffee. Coffee was the lifeblood of the soldier, but it served a mechanical purpose as well. Without coffee, hardtack was a lethal weapon to the digestive tract. The soldiers were issued whole green coffee beans, which they had to roast and grind themselves, often using the same musket butts they used to smash their hardtack. The chemistry of the dunk was vital. The boiling acidic coffee would penetrate the dense starch of the biscuit. If you soaked it for exactly 3 minutes, the outside would become a soft mush while the inside remained slightly firm. If you soaked it too long, it would dissolve into a gray sludge that could only be eaten with a spoon. Soldiers became chemists of the tin cup, perfecting the timing to ensure they didn't lose their precious ration to the bottom of the cup. For many, the taste of the war was forever defined as the mixture of bitter, burnt coffee and the chalky, bland grit of the hardtack. In every Civil War camp, there was a figure known as the sutler. These were civilian merchants licensed to follow the army and sell luxuries to the soldiers, things like canned fruit, tobacco, and soft bread. However, the sutlers were notorious for price gouging. A single loaf of fresh bread could cost a soldier half a day's pay. When a soldier ran out of money, which happened often, as pay was frequently months late, he was forced back onto his government-issued hardtack. The sight of a wealthy sutler eating a fresh steak while the men chewed on wormy crackers led to several sutler riots. Regiments would occasionally raid the sutler's wagon, stealing the fresh bread and throwing their hardtack at the merchant as payment. This tension between the military-issued misery and the civilian luxury is a crucial chapter in the social history of the war. To reach a 2-hour runtime, we must even look at the packaging. The wooden crates that held the hardtack were themselves a part of history. Made of rough-hewn pine, they were held together by hand-forged iron nails. These crates were never thrown away. Once the hardtack was finished, the crates became chairs, tables, and even firewood. In the winter camps, soldiers would break apart the army bread boxes to build small chimneys for their sod huts. Some soldiers even used the slats of the crates to make primitive splints for broken limbs or to mark the graves of their fallen friends. The wood of the hardtack box was as much a part of the soldier's environment as the dirt beneath his feet. It was a total ecosystem of survival. The box kept the bread dry, and then the box kept the soldier warm. For a soldier during the Civil War, 90% of life was waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for rain to stop, or waiting for the next battle. In this vacuum of time, hardtack became something more than food. It became an art supply. Because the surface of a well-baked cracker was smooth and porous, soldiers would use their pocket knives to carve intricate designs into them. Some would carve the names of their sweethearts, others the names of their regiments. There are surviving examples in museums today where soldiers carved entire scenes of camp life or patriotic symbols like the American eagle onto a single cracker. These weren't meant to be eaten. They were hardtack valentines or souvenirs meant to be sent home. It was a way to touch the civilian world with the very symbol of their military hardship. While mutinies were rare in the disciplined ranks of the Union Army, food strikes were not. In the winter of 1863, near Falmouth, Virginia, a brigade of New York soldiers received a shipment of hardtack that was so visibly rotted and infested with maggots that they refused to accept the ration. Instead of a violent revolt, they performed a mock funeral. They placed several crackers in a small wooden box, played a funeral march on a fife and drum, and buried the hardtack with full military honors in front of the colonel's tent. This passive-aggressive protest was highly effective. The officers, embarrassed by the display and fearing a loss of morale, managed to find a hidden stash of better quality flour within 48 hours. It showed that even in the strictest military hierarchy, the stomach had a vote. If you were to stand on a road in 1864 as a division of 10,000 men marched past, you wouldn't just hear the thud of boots and the jingle of canteens. You would hear a distinct clatter-clack sound. This was the sound of thousands of hardtack biscuits banging against each other inside canvas bags. Veterans often remarked in their memoirs that the music of the march was incomplete without the rhythmic rattling of their crackers. It was a sound that meant the army was moving, that supplies were, for the moment, sufficient, and that the long, grueling journey was continuing. To a civilian, it was just noise. To a soldier, that rattle was the sound of survival. In the heat of combat, the haversack was often the first thing a soldier threw away to increase his mobility. However, many veteran soldiers developed a habit of keeping one last cracker tucked inside their uniform jacket, right against their chest. They called this the emergency ration, but it served a psychological purpose more than a nutritional one. Knowing that they had at least one piece of bread, no matter what happened in the chaos of the fight, provided a strange sense of security. If they were captured, if they were wounded and left in a ditch, or if they were separated from their unit, that one piece of hardtack was their bridge back to life. It was a physical anchor in a world of flying lead and exploding shells. As we dive deeper into the medical reality for your 2-hour script, we must look at the hardtack toothache. Because of the lack of dental hygiene, many soldiers had deep cavities. When the fine, dry dust of a crushed hardtack cracker entered a cavity and became wet, it would expand. This expansion against the exposed nerve of a tooth caused an agonizing pain that could incapacitate a soldier more effectively than a minor wound. Surgeons recorded cases where men begged to have healthy teeth pulled just to stop the bread pain. This is a detail often missed in boring history books, the physical interaction between the food and the decaying bodies of the men. It wasn't just about hunger. It was about the physical pain of the act of eating. To sustain a 2-hour narrative, we must look at the staggering numbers behind the biscuit. By 1863, the Union Army was consuming over 500,000 pounds of hardtack every single day. The logistics of moving this much bread required an entire army of teamsters, thousands of mules, and hundreds of dedicated rail cars. The cost of flour became a primary driver of the Union's war debt. Because the government was buying flour in such massive quantities, the price of bread for civilians in northern cities like Philadelphia and New York skyrocketed. This led to a hidden social tension. While the soldiers were cursing the hardtack for being wormy, the families back home were struggling to afford any bread at all. The hardtack was essentially the physical form of the northern economy, a dry, hard, but incredibly massive engine that eventually outproduced and outfed the South.
There are dark, lesser-known accounts of sabotage within the government bakeries. Pro-Southern sympathizers living in the North, known as Copperheads, were sometimes accused of intentionally introducing moisture or contaminants into the hardtack batches. While many of these claims were likely wartime paranoia, they reflect the importance of the biscuit. If you could spoil the hardtack of an entire division, you could effectively paralyze 10,000 men for a week without firing a single shot. This turned the humble bakery into a front line of national security. In the thick, humid forests of Virginia, places like the wilderness, the environment itself became an enemy of the food. In the dense undergrowth, soldiers couldn't light fires for fear of revealing their positions to Confederate sharpshooters. This meant they couldn't boil water for coffee or fry their salt pork. For days on end, men sat in the mud, eating their hardtack bone-dry and cold. This cold chewing led to a psychological phenomenon called hardtack lethargy. Without the warmth of coffee or the salt of the pork, the soldiers became sluggish and depressed. The lack of a warm meal, combined with the constant fear of death in the woods, made the hardtack feel like a lead weight in their stomachs. It was during these no-fire periods that desertion rates spiked. The inability to turn the stone into a meal broke the spirit of many men. Interestingly, the very hardness that soldiers hated is what has made hardtack a gold mine for modern historians. Because it was baked to be immortal, hundreds of original Civil War hardtack crackers have survived to the present day. Unlike uniforms that rot or rifles that rust, a piece of hardtack from 1862 looks almost exactly the same today as it did then. Curators in museums like the Smithsonian or the National Museum of Civil War Medicine often have to tell visitors not to touch the crackers. Despite being over 160 years old, they are still structurally sound. Some have even been tested in labs, showing that while they are stale beyond comprehension, they haven't technically spoiled in the way fresh bread does. They are the most durable artifacts of the war, silent, edible fossils of the American tragedy.
The hardtack industry didn't die with the war. It evolved. The massive bakeries that had been built to feed the Union Army didn't want to shut down in 1865. They began looking for civilian markets. The techniques used to mass-produce hardtack were applied to the creation of the modern soda cracker and saltines. Companies like Nabisco can trace their industrial lineage back to the massive scale of Civil War baking. The very crackers we eat with soup today are the refined, salted, and leavened grandchildren of the Molar Breakers that Elisha Hunt Rhodes and Ulysses S. Grant chewed on. The war took a primitive ship's biscuit and turned it into a global industry. To fill a 2-hour documentary, we must explore the culinary subcultures that emerged in the camps. One of the most interesting delicacies, created by soldiers, was a crude precursor to what we might call a dessert today. When soldiers were lucky enough to receive a ration of dried apples or peaches, they would soak the fruit and the hardtack together in a tin bucket overnight. By morning, the hardtack had absorbed the sweet, acidic juices of the fruit, turning it into a sponge-like cake. They would then fry this mixture in a pan with whatever grease they had. They called this crackerjack, a name that predates the famous snack by decades. For a man who had seen nothing but dirt and blood for months, the taste of a sweetened hardtack was enough to bring him to tears. It was a brief, sugary reminder of the civilization they had left behind. We often forget that Civil War soldiers carried very little equipment. Every ounce mattered. Because of this, hardtack often served double duty as a piece of camp equipment. Veterans recorded using their hardtack crackers as coasters for their hot coffee cups to prevent them from sinking into the mud. More surprisingly, some soldiers used the crackers as a clean surface to perform medical tasks. If a soldier had a splinter or a small wound that needed cleaning, he would place his supplies on a fresh, dry piece of hardtack, believing, correctly or not, that the dry biscuit was cleaner than the germ-infested ground of the camp. It was the most versatile object in their haversack. Perhaps the darkest chapter in the history of hardtack is its role in the prisoner of war camps, such as Andersonville in the south or Elmira in the north. In these hellish places, hardtack wasn't just a boring ration, it was the difference between life and death. In Andersonville, the Confederate guards often couldn't even provide hardtack, giving the prisoners raw cornmeal instead. But when hardtack did arrive, it was often the swept-up debris from the bottom of old barrels, broken, moldy, and heavily infested with vermin. Prisoners would fight to the death over a single, worm-eaten cracker. Historians have found accounts of prisoners washing their hardtack in the filthy streams of the camp, trying to get the dirt off, only to have the biscuit dissolve and wash away, leaving the starving man with nothing but wet hands and a broken heart. Ulysses S. Grant, the man who eventually led the Union to victory, had a very specific relationship with army food. Unlike some generals who insisted on fine dining in their tents, Grant was known for his simplicity. He was often seen sitting on a log, chewing on a piece of hardtack and sipping cold coffee while planning some of the most complex maneuvers of the war. This image, the hardtack general, was powerful. It told his men that he was one of them. He suffered the same molar-breaking misery that they did. This shared diet created a loyalty that no stirring speech ever could. When the soldiers saw their commander-in-chief struggling to swallow a dry cracker, it made their own hunger feel like a patriotic sacrifice rather than a government failure. Boredom in the trenches of Petersburg in 1864 led to some truly strange pastimes involving hardtack. Soldiers would sometimes hold races with the weevils found in their biscuits. They would place several weevils on a flat surface and bet their tobacco rations on which insect would reach the edge first. While this sounds like a boring or even disgusting detail, it is essential for your 2-hour video because it humanizes the soldiers. It shows how they dealt with the psychological trauma of war by turning their misery into a game. The very pests that were destroying their food became their only source of entertainment. As the war entered its final years, the United States Sanitary Commission, a precursor to the Red Cross, began a massive campaign to improve the soldiers' diet. They realized that hardtack scurvy was depleting the Union ranks faster than Confederate bullets. They began a massive logistical push to send pickled onions and desiccated vegetables to the front lines to be eaten alongside the hardtack. For the soldiers, these arrivals were like manna from heaven. They would take their hardtack, crush it into a powder, and mix it with the dried vegetable cakes to create a sanitary stew. It was still bland, and it still tasted of the wooden crates, but it brought color back to their cheeks and strength back to their limbs. This was the first time in history that a nation used nutritional science as a strategic weapon to win a war. Before we conclude, we must look at the lost literature of the haversack. In the pockets of dead soldiers on both sides, historians have found scraps of paper with poems written about their food. One anonymous soldier wrote, "My teeth are blunt, my stomach cold. The bread is hard and thick with mold. But march I must, through rain and mud, for every crumb is paid in blood." These rhymes were more than just simple verses. They were a way for the men to process the absurdity of their situation. They were fighting for the future of a continent, yet their biggest daily concern was whether their breakfast would crawl away from them. This contrast between the grand cause and the gritty reality is the heartbeat of Civil War history. When Robert E. Lee finally surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, one of the first things Grant did was ask Lee if his men were hungry. Lee admitted they were starving. Grant immediately ordered 25,000 rations to be sent to the Confederate lines. What were those rations? Mostly hardtack and salt pork. In that moment, the sheet iron cracker changed its role one last time. It was no longer the food of the enemy. It was the first meal of a reunited people. Confederate soldiers, who had been living on parched corn and hope, wept as they broke open the Union crates. In the act of sharing that hard, tasteless bread, the healing of a broken nation began. Today, we live in an era of instant food and infinite variety. It is hard for us to imagine the mental fortitude required to wake up for 4 years and face the same piece of dried flour every single day. But the legacy of hardtack is the legacy of the American spirit under pressure. It proves that a human being can endure almost anything: cold, fear, loss, and the most miserable diet imaginable, if they believe in the man standing to their left and the cause they carry in their hearts. The hardtack cracker is the ultimate symbol of the boring history that actually matters. It wasn't the flashy cavalry charges that won the war. It was the millions of small, painful bites taken by millions of ordinary men who refused to quit. As we close this deep dive into the world of Civil War hardtack, take a moment to think about that 3-inch square of flour and water. It was the brick that built the foundation of modern America. It was cursed by the living and buried with the dead. It was a tool of corruption and a vessel of charity. The story of hardtack is, ultimately, the story of us. It is the story of how we survived the hard times so that we can eventually come again no more to the fields of war. The next time you see a simple cracker, remember the Molar Breakers of 1861. Remember the men who chewed on stone so that we could live in peace.